Today we are jumping into a curvy quilt, but this is very beginner friendly. The curves are all really gentle and we're going to take it step by step. For this quilt, you will need one layer cake and that's it, but it is a 42 piece layer cake. I know some might come with only 40 squares. If yours is in that family of layer cakes, then you'll just need to grab some scraps or an extra fat quarter to supplement your layer cake. You will also need the pattern, which is free on the website. It has the basic assembly instructions, but it also has all of the templates that you will need. All of the templates are whole except for template A, which you will need to tape together, which doesn't fit on one page. But all of the other templates are there and labeled for you to go along with the pattern. If you are not into paper templates, like I'm not into paper templates, you can also use this ruler. This is the Creative Grids Circle Savvy ruler, and it has all of the cutting marks that you will need to cut all of the arcs that we're going to use for our quilt. And this is a great one to have in your arsenal. If you do go with this route, you might also want to pick up one of these smaller rotary cutters. This is a 28mm rotary cutter, and it just makes cutting in those arcs a little easier. It can turn a little tighter. The 45 standard millimeter rotary cutter might have a little bit of trouble not gouging your ruler or making your cutting a little more difficult. So these are really handy to have for not only this curvy template, but any curves that you're going to cut. The first thing we need to do is take apart our layer cake and sort it into piles. These are going to be sets that are all going to work together as we cut and assemble our blocks. So we need 6 sets of 7 squares each. I am just going to grab 7 squares kind of at random throughout this so that we can make one full set together. So the idea behind this quilt is that we are going to cut an arc into each of our 10-inch squares, and then we are going to shuffle those so that they fit together. Because when you are sewing curves, the inside pie piece needs to overlap that outside crust piece by about a 1/2 inch. And if you were to cut an arc into a 10-inch square and then sew those 2 pieces back together, then the edges wouldn't quite line up. So shuffling it allows us to make this curvy quilt with basically no waste. There's just going to be a couple pieces left over at the end. I've aligned my 10-inch square with this black line on the ruler that says 1/4 inch seam allowance. And for all the squares that we cut, we're going to line up with that line, not the fold line. That is if we wanted to do a circle or a semicircle. The A template is the same size as the 15 line on this ruler. So I am going to just cut along the 15. So now I have a pie piece and a crust. This crust is actually one of the few leftover bits in this quilt. So we're going to set this aside and put this crust piece right here. Now I'm going to grab my next square and line it up on the ruler, that same seam allowance line. But this time I'm going to cut on the 14th line. Same confident cutting motion. And now I have a pie piece and a crust piece. Now this crust piece matches up with our A template pie piece. I'm going to just sandwich those together, maybe fold them up in half and set them aside. This, once we sew it together, will be one of our blocks. Now we have our B arc from the 14 line on our ruler, and we're going to grab the next square and line it up with the ruler. Now we cut 15 first, then 14. Now we're going to cut 13. And now we're going to follow our same pattern. We have an arc piece that fits our pie piece from the previous cut. We're going to just layer those, fold them together, and set them to the side. And now we have a 1/4 circle that needs an outside crust piece. So we're going to grab another square. This one was cut at 13. Now we're going to cut at 12. And now we have a crust piece for our pie piece. And that is how we are going to work through each of our piles of 7 squares. We're going to grab another square, make the crust piece for the previous pie piece, and have a pie piece left over to work forward. At the end, we will have one little pie piece that is left over that is scrap. But out of our 7 squares that we started with, we're gonna end up with 6 blocks. So you're gonna repeat this process for each of the 6 bundles of 7 squares, and you're gonna end up with 36 little pairs of a crust and a pie that matches. And then we're gonna sew them together. So let's talk about actually sewing these 2 pieces together, because it really looks like this curve just does not fit into this curve. And looking at it, looking at these cut edges, that's true. This curve is longer than this curve. But remember, we are not sewing together the cut edges of these 2 pieces. We're sewing together a line that is 1/4 of an inch in from the edge. So this curve will be just a little bit shorter, and this curve will be just a little bit longer. And at those points, these 2 pieces do match up. If you are new to curves, start with your larger curves. This is, I think, one of the 14, 15 curved pieces, that A-B template that we cut. And these are bigger circles, so they're going to be easier to sew, as opposed to something like this piece, which has a tighter radius. This is going to be a little bit more difficult to sew. So start with these big pieces, get some curving sewing under your belt, and then tackle these smaller pieces. And you'll find that these are much easier once you have a little experience with the larger pieces. But regardless of the size of curve, they all go together in exactly the same way. There are many different techniques for sewing together curved pieces. I'm going to show you how I do it, but explore other methods. In addition to my method, you can also glue base your pieces. You can use special feet on your machine to sew them together. You can use more pins, fewer pins. There's as many different ways to sew curves as there are quilters. So use what works for you. I'm finding the center point of this curve by folding it right sides together, and I'm just aligning these 2 edges and finger pressing it in the center. And that just gives me a line that will allow me to line up the center point of this. I'm going to fold this one wrong sides together to find that center point. And I'm going to do that so that these 2 points, these 2 folds in our fabric nest together. Rather than being like point to point, these will fit together and just allow us to line things up just a little bit more evenly. So I'm going to put my crust right sides together on top of my pie, and I am lining up that center point that I folded into each one. And I am also taking a look at these points out here. I want to make sure that these points are square to each other. It doesn't do me a lot of good if I have aligned these 2 points, but these points are way off. It's going to make it a little bit more difficult to ease these curves together. So when you're aligning, align your folds, your finger presses, and make sure that your pieces are square to each other. So I'm going to grab a pin, and I am going to pin the center point. And I am going to take 2 little bites at my fabric so that this pin is really secure and will prevent these 2 fabrics from shifting or rotating against each other. Now the other points that I pin are these 2 edges. This is our curved piece, and these are the sides of our layer cakes. We want to bend these around so that those edges match up. And I just take it one at a time. I line my cut edge and my layer cake edge up and stick a pin in there. And then I'm going to do the other side. Now I have this weird looking piece, but you can see how the cut edges are starting to line up a little bit. This is as many pins as I personally use, but you could, if you wanted to, add another pin at the halfway point. Just use your fingers to feed these pieces together and add another pin right here to subdivide this again. And you could add pins as frequently as you wanted so that your work at the sewing machine goes a little more smoothly. I prefer to pin a little more quickly, and then we're going to move to the sewing machine. So once I'm at my sewing machine, I want to make sure that those corners are still nicely aligned. I am using my seam guide here just to give me a nice 1/4 of an inch seam allowance against my curved cut pieces here. So here is my pin holding that first corner together, and I have the curved piece, the pie piece, flat against my sewing machine table. And the crust piece is kind of all folded up on top, and we're going to be easing this around this curve as we sew. But I'm going to take a couple of stitches just to secure this corner. And I'm going to remove my pin. And now those couple of stitches are going to act as a pin replacement. So here is my center pin, and I want to use this as an anchor point to help me ease this fabric to this curve. And I put my finger on top of this middle pin, and I just add a little bit of tension to this curved piece. I just inch it out just a little bit, just so there aren't any wrinkles, and it provides just a little tension. And that is going to help this piece. I can grab it by the outside and just ease it right against there. And as soon as it starts to line up, I'm going to use my fingers to hold it in place. And now my fingers are the pins, and now I can sew, just removing my fingers as I come to them. You can readjust if necessary. If you start to see this little bubble of fabric, you can lift your presser foot up a little bit and just ease it out of the way. I'm using this hand back here to rotate this fabric through the foot as it sews so that I get that nice even curve. And my goal is to keep my cut edges right up against my seam guide. As soon as I get to that pin, that middle center pin, I can remove it. And now we're going to repeat that process with the second half. Now I have bisected this second segment so I can sew from the center to this first pin. And I'm just going to ease that fabric so that the cut edges are aligned and sew. See how this hand isn't moving back as I am sewing? It's just rotating, and it's pulling that fabric through, helping to accentuate that curve and make it nice and smooth. So I have the last pin here. I'm going to put my finger on it and just give it a slight tug. See how there's this bubble here? I'm going to just give it a slight tug to flatten that out, and then I'm going to use this hand to push that cut edge of the crust piece up against the edge. As soon as it's aligned, I can go ahead and sew. I like to pull this pin out so that I don't sew over it, but I don't pull it out all the way. I keep it just out of the way of the foot, and once I'm completely done, then I remove it. And that is my curved seam. Open it up, and it looks perfect. If you happen to see any tiny little folds develop in this crust piece, I don't have any on this piece, but I got pretty close right here. Don't judge it too quickly. Go ahead and press it out, because when you flip this fabric out, it might not be at all visible on this side. So before you rip it out, at least open it up and take a look at it and see if when you press it out, it will look flat from this side. All that's left is to press this block. I like to press my seam allowances open even on curves, but you can press whichever way is most comfortable to you. I have already finished my stack of blocks, and I am ready to assemble my quilt top. There are a couple of different layout options for this quilt. You can assemble these curves so that they form wonky circles like this, or you could do a more random arrangement so that the curves don't necessarily line up. They're more of a scattered look like this. Either option will be a 6x6 layout, so 6 blocks by 6 blocks. So once you decide on a layout, then you will sew your blocks together into rows, and then your rows together into your finished quilt top. I'm going to get my quilt top all assembled and then quilt it. I opted for the circles layout, so all of my quarter circles come together and it ends up making 9 of the kind of full circles when they are joined. I think this quilt is a lot of fun. It finishes at about 54 or so inches square and is the perfect size for cuddling on the couch for a movie. I quilted it with bright orange thread for some added fun, and I even pieced the back with some of the leftover bears and sweaters fabric I had. I even made a fun label. So I hope you guys really enjoyed this little introduction to curved piecing, and I will be back soon with some more projects. Until then, happy quilting.